Welcome back. We're continuing on by cleaning the intermediate housing of all the clutch disc dust that was there, as well as everything around the starter. We're now going to finish by polishing up the edges on there with quadruple zero steel wool, but also our flywheel is back. Remember, I preserved an indexing by the serial number there and two red arrows surrounding it. Our top arrow will be indicated just to the left, right there, of our center point when we go to mount it. So the flywheel is going to be returned back to its original and correct place, as well as the spacer. Now all Fiat 120s bolts, they're all cleaned and tidy also. Tried all the threads, and we are ready to go and install the new pilot bearing. Have to remove the old one there still, and then mount the flywheel. Use your favorite bearing puller to remove the pilot bearing. Once the old pilot bearing is removed, I like to wipe one drop of your favorite lubricant on the casing inside, and then another drop on the outside exterior race, and then tap this in with a heavy hammer. I also use the old bearing as a guide to there, and chase that in until you hear a high-pitched ringing. That means you've bottomed out. I also measured ahead of time, and I knew this would be a little bit proud, so it is now seated. We have our pilot bearing in. It's time to reinstall the flywheel. We've got it surfaced back from Kelly Machine, and we want to make sure that we replace it exactly as it was before. Now we have the serial numbers on it stamped into it, and you see on the washer plate there, I made two red marks centering it around that serial number. I also put a single red mark just to the left of the top center bolt. So in this way, I can associate and replace the flywheel and the securing washer in the exact position that it came off the engine. So we've remounted the flywheel, and I've left the bolts clear so we can actually see the red markings. Here's the red marking that is just left of the dead center, and here are the two red markings I made that straddle the serial number. Serial number is directly opposite this hole, so everything lines up with exactly the way we took it off, and even the Fiat 120 bolts are being put. I have two more to put in, but we couldn't see those markings. I'm actually going to take some time to clean these off now, because I did not clean. While I cleaned the rest of the plate, I left these preserved for the markings. I'll take a little wipe on those, and as well as we want to come across after this and do a final wipe. This has to be surgically clean. The bolts on and tighten in a standard fashion. I've used a thread locker very sparingly on the threads at tack point, and if you're going to use a torque wrench, you'll need to stop the nut on the back side of the crank. But I found the flywheel nuts to 62 foot-pounds. The proper way to secure the crankshaft from rotating on you when you apply this torque is to use a 36 millimeter nut on the other side with a helper or a 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch drive securing it. I don't have any of those, so what I've done is I've used an 8 millimeter cap bolt and secured it into one of the clutch mount holes and put the other ring of the wrench on there. So when I press on this and start applying force, I can now torque this without the flywheel or the crankshaft moving on. Use your favorite brake cleaner and clean off all the surfaces. After torquing, wipe off all the parts with brake parts cleaner. Wipe all the clutch surfaces and machine parts. Even though they look brand new, they may have residual oil on them. All right, using your homemade alignment tool, set it in there, place the disc over it and the clutch plate over it. Then install each of the cleaned up 6 Allen head screws with flat washers on there loosely by finger. Then you can still move the clutch disc around by moving it this way and center it as best you can. What we'll do is we'll offer up the bell housing to the splines. Let's remove this now, bring it out. We can see that's really close. We'll be able to offer up the bell housing before we secure. Now, all of these are finger tight, but it is just barely holding. And this will be our starting point. We'll put up the bell housing, make sure the spline's there in correct position, and then confirm the fit, pull the bell housing off, then come back and tighten each one of these to torque values. I fit the bell housing on, and it's at that point where the pilot bearing needs to start seating. And I see I have an instruction over here. That was causing it. Okay. Yeah, we are. Push this as far as I can. We can get it. I'm going to start securing a few nuts to pull it right in, and hopefully that will center the clutch to its final position. We'll then pull it out, shoot it with brake cleaner again, and tighten down. I've placed 4 bolts on there at the 4 quadrants. And that pulls the bell housing and the center right through the pilot bearing. So now we have our final position of the clutch, and we can remove the bell housing, do our final clean, secure the clutch disc and pressure plate down, and then wait for our new bearings to come in on the house. Pull the bell housing out and secure the 6 Allen head screws for the clutch to the flywheel with 30 pounds of foot torque. Lock our flywheel to a stud using a double box end wrench, and then torque each of the clutch studs to 400 kilogram meters, which is 28.9 foot-pounds. But the spec, Ferrari spec says it. Let's see if I can do this. Boom. Now let's go around. Pounds of foot torques are in. Remove the drop gear lower outer race using the divot in it behind it to get a drift in. And then once the drift has pushed it out a little bit, hit all 3 sides of the ring in a concentric circle and remove the drop gear bearing outer ring. Now we'll use the old outer ring as a press in. Use a little bit of assembly oil on the outside and hammer it in. Gently tap the new bearing in using the old outer race as a tap guide and install it until the circlip will fit in there, such as that area. There we go. Since we do have the big kahuna, most expensive bearing in the car is a double roller, and it's slotted in there. That's a lot of money right there. We're going to just 438 euros before shipping. Right there, we're going to just check it to see if it's worthy of the clutch shaft here. And the old one I left it there so I could check the orientation of the new one, the sizing and everything. I do like this new bearing. We're going to start installing it on the clutch shaft with its intermediate lightly, then back it off just a 1/16 of a turn and use a little bit of our bicycle lube to start the new bearing on. Now to tap the new bearing down, I've been finding a 24 millimeter socket worked until then I ran out. What I found is the old throwout bearing, that edge very nicely closer to the inside, so I'm only striking the inner race. So it's actually dirty, so what I've been doing is putting a towel over it and striking it like that off camera. And you can see it's proceeding down. We're almost there. And we bottomed out. This is installed. One way to check is to hold the outer race and rotate the clip around, which I was able to do with 2 hands. Now there's a silent spin, even with my pinky. New bearings in, spacer rings on, and we're ready to start the install into the bell housing. Lubricated the edges, slid it in, and I indexed the seating seal of the ring to the outflow hole. This is actually a lubrication hole right here, and our split ring allows it to pass through and into the bearing. Then bead of ultra black on the edge here, just to seal it. Bearing guide to its indent over the bell. Lightly grease the ball point pivot of the clutch fork as well as the 2 contact of the forks, and slip it into the throwout bearing's retaining spring and place it into the hole. Lightly lubricate the shaft here with grease and insert throwout bearing up high so that the springs can contact the fork. Insert the fork through the hole, mate the spring up on the pivot point. At the same time, you slip the forks underneath the fork and the clutch spring up with this way. So as soon as you force the fork into the detent of the pivot ball, the spring will also clip on to the fork's retaining slots. With it all in one motion, it all clips in, and you can see the motion. I'll wipe off all excess grease. Make sure the grease on that you lubed on the shaft is evenly spread and not clumping anywhere. I see a little bit at the bottom. Clean that up. And you're ready to go. Back at the bench, putting in the bearings. I wanted to go over one tech point before we get too far in it. I have used a lot of brake cleaner to clean the housing, and it is still preservation quality, but still shows quite a bit of dirt. Should you want to go Concord quality, here's what I say. Use a can of brake cleaner. Clean the surface properly and prep it, and then shoot it with paint. There's some wonderful paints out there. Duplicolor makes a cast coat aluminum DE 1650, which will mimic the texture and luster of aluminum. And how good is that? Here's one I've painted already, a bracket, and you can see it has all the original marks, but it's just super clean, but not overly clean, right? All the luster is there, but it's not too, the highlights don't really pop out. It's dull luster. It's amazing what they can do with paint these days. Duplicolor DE 1650. Now I'm going to go for preservation quality, so I'm going to leave it as it is. Grease the olive bearing in here, as well as the pivot pin, and reattach the circlip. Now that our bell housing is ready to mount, I wanted to take a moment just before that and outline something I think is a real feature of our new bearing. Here's our old bearing set. Remember, we had to release the bell housing and tap this center from its side because it is so large that it does not pass through the 36 millimeter hole in the back of the case there. As you see, the rollers and their cage are attached to the inner race of the old bearing. Notice when I tapped it in, I tapped in the outer race that is now attached with its cage and rollers, and it is the inner race which is free, right? Right now, I can slip. It's going to slip through. It goes through the other way. What this means is it will slip through when you pull the bell housing off. Bottom line, you no longer have to mess with removing this clip, this race, this bearing or cage system. The whole bell housing will slip right out. Wow, I like this new bearing so much more. I've already put another one in my shopping cart. And I think good things like this, I think it's an improvement, and I'm afraid that good things like this tend to go away. So I am thinking about buying an extra one, but this is a really great feature of the new bearing that's gone in. One point I did not mention on the new bearing, you absolutely positively must have the spacer on the input shaft to the transaxle before you bring the housing up. You will not be able to get it through this bearing. Make it easy. Install the spacer on the transaxle input shaft now before mating the bell housing is to insert the spacer. With our new lower drop gear bearing, it will not clear through the inner race area. So we need to make sure we install this now before we even start, and that way the clutch housing. Plus, in the future, when we go to take the bell housing off again, we won't have to fiddle around with the lower drop gear bearing. It'll slip right out through the inner race. It's a different configuration, but still the same dimensions as the original. To prep the bell housing, I placed the 3 O-rings in their seated positions, but Ferrari is using them as crush gaskets, not as proper O-rings. So I've also used my favorite RTV Ultra Black around them also. As we saw with the inside of the clutch housing, machine faces were so flat that most of it squirted out. I had to double check it. On this case, I'm using it sparingly and around some of the lower studs to prevent oil leakage. But now that we have the O-rings and a silicone sealant around the 3 rings, we are ready to mate our bell housing up to the flywheel and clutch assembly. Rotate the center cog, and there we can feel the bell housing sitting, and we were able to get our bearing here on and off without the race. The spacer's in there. Let's check our dimensions and tighten it down. Install the bell housing nuts to finger tight. Torque the casing nuts to 400 kilogram centimeters or 29 foot-pounds. I've started to install the inner race of the lower drop gear here. I've used red tacky, squirted some between the rollers as well as on the face of the inner race and the splines here. This, of course, will be lubricated by the gear oil. I am going to change oil after a 200-mile fresh run in this. That's just as a flush. I'm also using red tacky grease on the inner bearings of the middle drop gear, as well as assembly faces and splines for your drop gear ring nuts. These ring nuts really need to seat at 147, and lubricating the spline as well as their faces are the right way to make that facilitated. So let's finish our assembly. We know the direction of the gears because the back side of each of the gears has the number on it, and there, this lower drop gear is the faintest. There it is, 447. There's our assembly. I am using the gear to lightly push this in. It is a little firm in there, and you can see that it is just requiring a little bit of tapping. Tap that in every once in a while, rotating the shaft. Use an oversized socket as a drift. Your heel ring nut, grease both the surface and the spline before applying. Here, getting a little firm with the locking, and now we come along with our impact wrench. I have now reconnected the spring using the cordage trick. The clutch cable is attached behind. I have loosened our free play adjustment right here. There's two opposing direction lock nuts and a center turn nut on the spindle. I have backed it off almost all the way and testing the free play. I have set up a stick on the clutch pedal, and that should allow us to have free. So our clutch action is good. So we've confirmed our free play motion. Our bottom and top gears are locked in. We can peen them, install the center again, and then clean the case edge and lock tight that up, or up your favorite Permatex sealant, and we will be ready to start our free play adjustments. We've just tested both ends, so we have a good start. Now that we have our drop gear, lower drop gear in, I've greased the inner bearing of the middle drop gear and will now place it in. It's on. Here is our number, so we know our stamped Ferrari number goes into the block. So let's insert our middle drop gear now. There's a rolling motion. Okay. Once inserted, we can check for flatness. Reinstall. As a final check afterwards, come across and feel and make sure the gears have full width contact and that the reinstall the middle drop gear and torque the top. Use your favorite hammer and drift to securely peen the ring nuts, and adding a thin bead of sealant around the edge. It's time to seal up the casing. Gently fit the drop gear cover over the casing. Gently snug the bolts up and then torque them to 20 foot-pounds. Put the car down onto the grounded level. Fill the gear oil through the top there. I use a funnel with a vinyl tube attached to it, and then we'll leave our cover off so we can do our measurement on the adjustment here. And we have our 11mm wrench for the double nut adjuster turnbuckle right down there. You loosen it up until you have a 2mm spacing between the engagement and the take-up. And that's your clutch job in a Dino 246.